Hey there, everyone. It's Jeremiah. A quick note before the show to give a plug to our Patreon account. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content like extra episodes and extended episodes. They get access to our Sticker of the Month Club, where we send out great stickers every single month. And they get access to our community Slack, where the community discusses the episodes and a lot more. If you'd like to support the podcast, if you enjoy the podcast, and you want to help us out, please consider signing up as a patron at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. That's patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Jenny Schuetz. She's an urban economist, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and author of the new book Fixer Upper, about America's housing market and all the things that are wrong with it. So, Dr. Schuetz, welcome to the show.
Good to be back.
So, I guess just to start off, what's the need for this book? What got you into wanting to write a book about the housing market? Obviously, this is something you've been working in kind of urban economics for a long time, but why specifically this?
Yeah, I think there are two main goals that I had with the book. One is that there's a lot of conversation about specific problems in housing markets and outcomes. So the lack of supply, rising prices, then there's sort of a separate conversation often about the plight of low-income households who don't get enough subsidy or how well the subsidy programs are working. So we tend to have these conversations about particularly the supply side and need for subsidies for low-income households as though they were separate conversations, and they're not. And it turns out there are a lot of pieces of the housing market that interact with one another. There are a whole network of policies at the federal, state, and local level that all interact, and currently they're all interacting to reinforce bad outcomes. So we need to think about how to change a bunch of things at the same time in order to get to better outcomes. So part of what I wanted to do, sort of the intellectual framework, is to put all of these different pieces together and show how they work together and how they coordinate. The other thing that I think is really important is that those of us in the housing sphere haven't done a good enough job in convincing the median voter, sort of the typical financially comfortable suburban homeowner, that things like the lack of affordable housing for poor people or the lack of supply of apartments in big cities matters for them too, right? This tends to be viewed as it's a problem for people who can't afford a decent place to live, but it's not my problem. I own a house in a neighborhood that I like, and I want to show people that in fact the sort of systemic problems in the system wind up costing American taxpayers money, wind up hurting regional and the economies and the national economy. And so this is really everybody's problem.
I think that's a really interesting point, and we're definitely going to come back to that. There's potentially an argument that for that suburban homeowner, it actually is in their self-interest to just continue doing what they're doing. But we'll come back to that. And I want to dive into the thesis of the book, which is essentially that the housing market is broken in a number of very interesting ways. It's not even broken in a single way, but I also want to talk about the outcomes that you mentioned. You talked about how the housing market is not producing the outcomes that we want. What are the things that we should be looking at when we look at a housing market to determine whether or not it's working? Because for a normal market, it seems pretty clear. Let's say the market for can openers as just a random consumer good. If can openers are plenty, if you can get them easily at many different kinds of stores and online outlets, if they don't cost very much, if you have a choice of variety, you can get the expensive one, you can get the cheap one. We would typically say that the market for can openers is working very well. It requires very little government intervention of any kind. What should we be looking at with housing markets to determine, is the market working?
Yeah, so that's a great analogy. Housing markets are more complicated than the market for can openers in a couple of ways. One of which is that houses are deeply rooted in a particular place, and so it's not in fact that easy to move them, right? So the market for can openers, you can make the can openers anywhere in the world and ship them to consumers, but when we make houses, they get consumed in the place that they're made because they're rooted in the ground. So one of the insights that comes from that is that there isn't really an integrated national housing market. There are lots and lots of local housing markets, and that in fact leads to some of the problems that we've observed. We're not building enough homes in the places that have really strong demand, places that have great labor markets, lots of amenities. Those are places where we have been systematically underproducing or underbuilding housing, in some cases for 30 years. And there are other places where we have too much housing, and where we're continuing to build too much housing, especially in places that are environmentally either risky or vulnerable. So the spatial nature of housing markets makes it more complicated to work correctly. But the really important distinction about housing markets relative to most other consumer goods and services is that it's not an unregulated market, and essentially we have granted local governments direct control over the supply of housing, because in order to build a home on a piece of land, you have to get explicit permission from the city or county in which the land is located. So that makes local governments literally the gatekeeper to the entire new production of housing. Local governments have in turn decided to lean heavily on the preferences of people who already live in that neighborhood. So then we wind up with the uncomfortable situation where current residents don't want more housing, don't want more neighbors, especially lower cost housing with lower income neighbors, and local governments defer to them, which then creates sort of these larger economic impacts. So we've sort of built a system that impedes markets from working the way we think markets normally should, and indeed this creates a lot of problems.
And what does it look like when the market is working like it should, in kind of a hypothetical world where we've solved these problems? What are the outcomes that we're trying to get in terms of cost, in terms of availability?
Yeah, so one of the clear implications is that we should have more housing produced in places with high demand. So you can think of this as places that have high prices or high rents, or where they've been increasing over time. So as indicators of strong demand, we should see a strong supply response. We should see more new housing units coming online. We would also expect in sort of a well-functioning market that there should be production or availability of homes at different price points and different structure types to meet different kinds of households, right? So let's say that we have a bunch of one-person households who want studio and one-bedroom apartments, and we have some 5- and 6-person households, families with kids, who want big houses with lots of bedrooms and backyards. A well-functioning market should be producing new units in proportion to kind of what people look for, right? So we should have a range of different structures, a range of different price and rent points, things for rent, things to purchase, and so a diversity of homes that match people's ability to pay and their preferences. So if we look at what the market actually is building now with all these restrictions, we're not building nearly enough homes in the places with strong demand. And we're not building homes that necessarily match people's ability to pay. In particular, there's not a lot of lower cost, smaller housing, even in places where land is super expensive, and that's what the market wants to build. So all of this can sort of tell us that the restrictions on the market, the regulations that local governments have in place, are not only stopping overall supply, but they stop some supply more than others.
There was something that I found very interesting in your book, and it was a discussion of how do we even measure how restrictive these kind of zoning policies or restrictions on housing generally are. Because it's kind of a very difficult thing to do when you think about it. In one sense, you could just look and see, okay, what percentage of each city is zoned for single family homes? And that would be a very crude way to measure this, right? But that's not going to work, because some cities have the root of their issue is in the fact that they only allow single family homes, and that's the majority of their zoning. But then other cities have kind of different issues. They might have something like, oh, well, our parking requirements are really onerous and it's, it makes it more expensive to build here. Or we have really tough environmental regulations that means that practically you can almost never build any major new, housing complexes. So how do you actually measure the restrictiveness of a local government's housing policies? If you can't really juggle, all these things, you can't say, well, here's a parking requirement versus a zoning code. There's no objective way to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that economists have been struggling with for decades now, and there's a huge economics literature trying to measure zoning, trying to get very specific about measuring the minimum lot sizes and things like setbacks and parking requirements and so forth. But you're absolutely right that in some sense, we don't care about any one of those rules individually. What we care about is the net impact on housing production and housing prices. And so, I find actually the most useful way to think about it's not even that we necessarily need to get a precise measure, like on a scale of 1 to 100, how restrictive is your zoning. What we want to be able to do for policy purposes is identify places, cities or metros or even neighborhoods within cities where the market is not responding the way we would expect it to. And so I actually find a very intuitive way to look at this is to just map changes in housing supply, whether that's a change in the number of units measured by the census, for instance, or building permits, to map that against some measure of prices or rents. And you can really do this with a bunch of different data points. So looking at levels of prices or rents, looking at changes over some period of time. But that's sort of your measure of demand, and then measure that against supply. And when you do that at almost any geography, you can see where there are places with strong demand and housing supply lags. So places that just haven't built that much housing. And when we can do this for neighborhoods across a city. So I've done this, for instance, for the District of Columbia where I live, and you can see that there are large parts of Northwest DC that are really affluent, that have very high housing prices, where lots of people would like to live. And in the last 25, 30 years, they've essentially added no new housing, right? So that's an indication that this is a place where the market is being constrained from what it wants to build.
This is almost very biblical in the sense, Jesus said, "I will measure you by your fruit. Ye shall know them by their fruit," I think was the quote. And it's basically saying, we're not going to look at zoning codes. We're just going to see, do you end up building housing or not? Kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the, first of all, it's an easy method to do with readily available data at lots of different geographies. And partly in the back of my head, I'm thinking about the solutions already. If we want to counter this tendency to not build enough housing in the right places, the federal government or state governments can do that by, creating some fiscal carrots and sticks for local governments. But the first step of that is we have to identify the places that are underbuilding, and we need to have a pretty intuitive measure to do that, and something that you can construct with readily available data, right, in a fairly transparent method. So that's one of
Yeah.
the reasons I like doing this, because it's easy to explain to people, and it's easy to just look at the data and say, here's a place where the market is out of whack.
Yeah, and there are states that have tried to do this, right? I know one of the new fronts in the YIMBY war, so to speak, is that they'd like states to kind of set goals, and if a locality does not meet their housing goals, then something will happen. Their zoning laws basically get overwritten, or something like that. I don't know the full details because I don't read the laws in detail, but I know that something like this is being attempted in California. Do we have any information about whether or not that kind of thing works in practice? Do other states have these kind of rules about, like, if everybody has to build a certain amount of housing, if not, you get punished in some way?
So California is the only state at the moment that has this sort of explicit quantitative target for local governments. And until very recently, they essentially haven't enforced it. So they would tell local governments, you need to produce X number of units, but if they didn't, there was really no penalty. And so places widely just didn't comply. Uh, there are a couple of states that do something a little bit different. So New Jersey and Massachusetts both have statewide fair share programs, which means they are actually looking not at the total amount of new housing production, but at the share of existing housing that is affordable to low-income households. So it's a slightly different goal. It's not so much, is your housing market overall working, but do you have some housing that can accommodate low-income households? And if not, what are you doing to fix that? So Massachusetts has what they call a builder's remedy, where local governments that don't have enough low-income housing, a developer can essentially just override the local zoning to build, say, an apartment complex where some of the units are set aside for low-income households. So that's one of the approaches that states can take. New Jersey's is a little bit different, but sort of the same concept. This is still, there are only a handful of states that have anything like this, but we're seeing a lot more interest from states that have never had a housing policy in doing something, because state governments are realizing their regional economy, their state economy is hurting because the most productive places aren't building enough homes, and then that puts pressure on employers. They can't hire and retain good workers. So states are really the ones who are feeling more of the pinch from this.
Yeah, it's funny. Earlier you said that we don't have a national housing market, and I mostly agree, but there is an interesting way in which we kind of do, in that, something like the Great Migration from California to Texas, for instance, which can be overstated sometimes. It's not a giant flood, but I think cities like Austin, their housing market as it currently stands is a direct result of San Francisco not having a functioning housing market, and it's like what you said about states are realizing this is bad for business, this is bad for their economy almost, if they can't figure out their housing market. I think California has certainly seen that, in that there are more people now leaving California than migrating to California. And that can only be a result of their housing market. And cities like Austin are kind of the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, California has created so many laws and policies that make it really hard for housing markets to function well, and created all of these distortions, that it is hurting the state economy and now spilling over to other places. Depending on your viewpoint, places like Austin, Salt Lake City, Denver, Boise, all of them have had big inflows of Californians looking for cheaper housing and, in many cases, a sort of a nicer quality of life. That's in some ways good for those cities and those local economies, because they get a bunch of really high-skilled people who want to come and start up businesses and work there and pay into the local tax revenues. But it's not great for people who live there and can't afford higher housing costs. So sort of whether that's a good thing or not that people are spilling out of California to Austin depends, I think, on whether you already own a home in Austin or whether you're trying to buy your first home there.
The eternal question. So something else you just mentioned that I'd love to get into, because this is actually at the end of your book. It's at the end of my notes, but it's where the conversation has taken us, is this state versus local dynamic. And I've been wrestling with this for a couple years now, that I honestly kind of believe that local government is detrimental in the way it's implemented in the United States. And that's a big, broad statement that needs all sorts of qualifications and all sorts of caveats, and particular cases are particular. But it sure seems like most of what local governments do is often really, really harmful, at least what you see in the news. And as it applies to the housing market, should we be taking control away from local governments? Should we be practicing less local democratic politics, in a sense? This is kind of a taboo question in some way, like taking control away from local communities sounds like a horrifying thing to do in the abstract, but those local communities, as you said, tend to produce outcomes at a regional level or at a metropolitan level that are pretty clearly negative for people in the area.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really complicated things when you get into talking about local government is just the diversity of local governments themselves. So the US has about 40,000 general purpose local governments, so a city or a county that kind of has broad purview over lots of things. So they run the schools and the police, and they set zoning laws and and housing policy and pick up the trash and all the rest of that. So we have 40,000 local governments, which is a lot, and 85% of those are for cities or counties with fewer than 10,000 residents. So just in the aggregate, we've got a ton of really, really small places that are charged with providing a lot of services, some of which are fairly straightforward and it makes sense to do at the local government level, right? It's sort of hard for me to imagine that like a state agency or a federal agency would be better at picking up the trash and the recycling and managing, local parks and green spaces and things like that. So it's not crazy to have local governments doing a bunch of stuff that mostly impacts the people in the immediate surrounding area. But I think we need to do a better job of aligning the incentives of local governments with sort of regional economies, regional labor markets in particular, and thinking about how they address the needs of poor people, because local governments will always have fiscal incentives not to allow development that costs them more than it brings in property tax revenues, right? So they try to restrict, for instance, development of low-income family housing if they're going to get a bunch of poor kids who go to school and need extra money to do well and perform well in school, but the low-income apartments maybe don't bring in a ton of property tax revenues. That's a clear negative for the local government. On the other hand, we badly need to have decent quality schools that low-income kids can go to so that they are well prepared to become adults and move into the labor market. So I think there's better alignment that can be done across the levels of government, but it's hard to imagine dissolving local governments or sort of taking away a lot of the fundamental purposes that they serve.
Would you say that it's a difference between things that impact people outside the community versus things that don't? If a local government is picking up trash, the method in which they choose to pick up the trash, private versus public versus, however they, schedules that they do it on, I don't know the differences in trash policy, which facility they send it to, normally doesn't have a huge impact on the surrounding areas, in the town 10 minutes over. But the housing policies of a local government will have a big impact on all their surrounding communities. Is that kind of the line we should be looking at what impact spreads out beyond the town?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can think of this in sort of economic terms. When the local government policies have externalities that impact either neighboring jurisdictions or kind of a larger regional area, then there's an argument to be made either for greater cooperation among localities or some sort of intervention by the state or creating kind of fiscal incentives for better outcomes. And housing is clearly one of those. So if every local government within a metro area chooses not to build low-income housing, that's in their individual financial incentive, but then the region doesn't have housing where, housekeepers and baristas and lots of low-wage workers can live, and the regional economy isn't going to function particularly well, right? And we see this clearly also for some of the climate impacts when local governments that are close to job centers and public transit don't build enough housing that's within close proximity to jobs and transit, and they essentially push a lot of the housing to the urban fringe, to these sort of farther out suburbs. That makes for more traffic, more driving, more pollution for the entire region. And essentially that's something where we need a larger level of government to step in and mitigate the impacts.
Yeah, this is just a thing I've been noodling on for a while now in general. I read a book a few years back called 10% Less Democracy by Garrett Jones, who's your friendly libertarian down at, he's at George Mason, I think. I hope I didn't get that wrong. But, he argues that, democracy is not bad, but that there are some instances where a little bit less democracy would probably be ideal. And that, one of the canonical examples is the local town meeting where people gather to protest a new housing development. It's technically very democratic. It's a very democratic thing to do. But, we might be thinking of it in the wrong way. But that's the thing I've been chasing.
Yeah, and it's definitely true that there are some policies that are really popular with local voters, and so local elected officials have an incentive to adopt them. that are clearly bad for regional or state or even national
And it's
interests.
like, what level of democracy are you at? Is it democracy by township or democracy by metropolitan area, or
Right.
what? Who gets to vote?
Yeah, well, the other piece to keep in mind is that the process of having everybody show up at the town meeting and register their complaints about something looks small d democratic from the outside, but it's actually not. In particular, because the people who show up at community meetings are not representative of the larger community. So there's some political scientists who've done really great work at this, matching the characteristics of people who show up to speak at community meetings with kind of the larger voting population. And the people who showed up to community meetings tend to be older. They're much more likely to be homeowners. They tend to be wealthier and whiter and more male than the overall city or town holding the meeting. So it's not a particularly representative form of government. It's selecting on people who have the time and resources to show up. And so I think we're misled to thinking that this is democratic when it's really not.
Hmm. One of the other ways I've seen this framed is, the United States is a federalist system. Obviously, we devolve a lot of power to states. And that makes a lot of sense, I think, in a country as big as ours. I don't think you can effectively manage a country of 350 million people, is it now, under a unitary system. But when you talk about something like the state of New Jersey, that's a much smaller unit, both geographically and population-wise. And it's pretty reasonable to imagine that New Jersey could just set all its own policies, but what we actually have is a sort of federalism within New Jersey as well, where there's hundreds of different local policies of all kinds. And at that level, there's a question of, does federalism make sense?
Yeah, and I really think that states are probably the right level of government to lean in more to housing policy because they're a reasonable proxy for a lot of the regional labor markets, which is like that's sort of the piece that's supposed to match housing, that you have enough homes to accommodate workers at different income levels, and that's sort of the metro area. But the state is probably the closest we have to the level of government that accommodates that. There are a couple. When I was writing the book, actually, one of my peer reviewers pushed back a little bit and said, "You have too much faith in state governments having the best interest of the localities or the residents at heart." And we do see some tensions, I think, especially in red states where they are trying to tie the hands of blue cities to do things like impose mask mandates in schools so that kids don't get sick. So it's not that state governments necessarily will do a better job, but I think it's sort of it feels like a better match to the right level of geography.
I think you're right, but I will say I laughed when you said you have too much faith in state governments, at that comment, just because I think literally yesterday, Governor of New York, where I live, Kathy Hochul, killed an ADU bill, an accessory dwelling unit bill, and an affordable housing bill that would have actually potentially been really transformative for New York. And she had gotten a lot of pushback from it, from Long Island NIMBYs, basically. And she kind of just ducked and said, okay, never mind, I give up, and killed that. And so when you said, you have too much faith in state government, it was a real shot to my heart right there.
Sorry about that. Yes. Yeah, and it's that we I think we came into this thinking that state governments get around some of the uncomfortable local politics, but of course state elected officials get elected by the same voters who are electing their city councils and their mayors, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in California we can see this really clearly. The people in the state legislature who've been fighting the hardest against kind of statewide zoning reforms come from some of the very NIMBY locations. So as long as you've got enough of those NIMBY places sending state legislators to Sacramento or to Albany, there's no reason to think the politics will be that much different.
I think you're right in the end that state governments are the right level to approach this at. It's certainly a more realistic approach than hoping that, we can hit all 40,000 townships and make something happen. But I want to shift the conversation a little bit because we've been talking about the build side, about all these restrictions that stop people from building and how state governments are really the right way to attack that. But that's a conversation that I think a lot of people are familiar with at this point, that, left to right, there seems to be a growing consensus, at least among the technocratic crowd, the wonk crowd. Everybody agrees we need more housing. The real disagreement is in how we build it. Even the most NIMBY politicians make a lot of gestures at like, yeah, we should build more housing, but just somewhere else, or just it has to be this particular kind of housing that might not ever realistically get built. But everybody feels the need to at least gesture, yeah, we know housing is important. So I want to talk about market interventions. And that's, I think, where a lot of the disagreements now are coming. We've mostly gotten people on the side of we need more housing. It's a question of what it looks like. So I'll start off kind of the market interventions, the government interventions conversation by asking, how do you think about this paradigm? Because there's a lot of things that people do. People propose cash programs, people propose rent control, they propose 20% of every new development must be affordable housing. There's rent vouchers. There's kind of this real maze of policy. There's no universal policy in this country. When you approach this problem, how do you think about the best way to help people? How much should the government be helping? What's the framework here?
Yeah, for low-income households, the problem is really that they don't earn enough money to pay for market rate housing without subsidy. So we know that there are a lot of people who earn really low wages, and that's what they get from the labor market. And the labor economists argue about whether or not they're getting paid fairly, and this is too much consolidation on the employers, right? But from the housing side, it's just their incomes are too low to afford the basic operating cost for a market rate apartment.
And do you mean that as a result of our distorted market, that markets are really distorted because of all the things we've been talking about, therefore housing costs are too high? Or is that a more general statement that no matter what, even if the market was well functioning, even in that case, there would be people who couldn't afford, market rate housing?
More the latter. And one way to think about this is that the poorest 20% of households everywhere in the country spend over half of their income on housing costs. And that's not just places like California, which aren't building enough housing. That's also true in, rural Mississippi and in, St. Louis and Cleveland, places where housing is objectively not that expensive, where there isn't a shortage of units, but the people who live there have very, very low incomes and can't afford the cost of a market rate apartment, right? So this is a universal problem. The poorest 20% of Americans just need more money. And because this is fundamentally about a shortfall of income, not excessively high housing prices, the best way to fix that is just give people more money, right? And so, in particular, places where housing is relatively abundant and cheap, just giving people more money, sending them checks every month that they can spend on housing or whatever would essentially solve the problem. That's not going to be by itself a solution in places like California, because increasing a bunch of subsidies, whether through vouchers or cash, without having more apartments, just increases the competition and doesn't actually make the housing situation better for poor people.
So you're definitely going to win friends on this podcast, I think, if you just say the solution to people not having enough money is to just give them money. That's an approach I think we're very fond of here. My audience is going to be very fond of. But I would love to throw some other things at you, and maybe we can even play a game. It's like rate it 1 to 10. And, how good is this policy in terms of helping people or in terms of the unintended consequences it would have? Let's say that giving people cash directly is a 9 out of 10, or maybe even a 10 out of 10. I'm going to throw some other policies and just give me a score. How good is this policy or not? What about rent vouchers? Things that, the federal government does some degree of this, I think, and it doesn't hit everybody. There's not enough of it to hit everybody who needs it. But programs like rent vouchers that you can specifically just spend on housing.
Yeah, they're probably an 8.5 out of 10 with the asterisk that there should be more of them.
What about something like affordable housing guarantees? And by that, I mean, a lot of places have rules where every 10% or 20% of a new project must be affordable. How would you think about that in terms of good policy, bad policy?
Yeah, that if I had to give an overall score, I'd say maybe 5 out of 10. And this one is a tough one because there's some places that have had inclusionary zoning programs like this that have produced a decent amount of housing for low income people that wouldn't have existed otherwise and don't seem to have really interfered that much with the market. So Montgomery County, Maryland is probably a good example. But most of the places that have an inclusionary zoning program have not, in fact, built much housing out of it. In fact, many of them have produced no affordable units, so it's just completely ineffective at its stated goal. And in some cases, they have interfered with housing markets. So this is one where, for some places, it's not a terrible idea. For a bunch of places, it's absolutely a terrible idea or has been implemented in ways that are entirely counterproductive.
Yeah, I tend to be skeptical of that, which maybe that's not surprising. This is the Neoliberal Podcast. I tend to be skeptical of a lot of things, but but the next one is rent control, and if you want to, you can even talk about the nuance of like hard rent controls versus like rent regulations, like like we have in New York City, that are technically less strict than controls. But in general, what do we think of rent control?
Yeah, I'd probably give rent control maybe a 3 to 4 out of 10. Even on the ones that are relatively more flexible, that they're not capping hard rents, they're capping the amount of rent increases. One of the problems is that rent control programs are not targeted to low income households. So there's actually a new paper looking at who benefits from rent control in New York City. And a lot of the people living in rent controlled apartments are non-poor people living in really expensive neighborhoods. So not where you would want the subsidy to go to. I think Oregon probably has the best of the newer rent regulation programs because it's not that restrictive, right? It's sort of capping what we might think of as rent gouging, but not capping increases so much that it's likely to make it hard to operate apartments. That one's still very new, so we don't have a lot of evidence on it. But of the programs that exist so far, sort of they don't deliver help to the people who need it. They create all kinds of distortions, and they don't solve the underlying problem, which is both a lack of income and a lack of housing.
And this one I'm very interested in your response to because in your book, you kind of give a very, I don't know how to say it, like a soft, very squeamish endorsement of public housing, but with like a lot of caveats. There was a discussion of public housing in your book and how market rate housing may not ever be the real solution to some people. But there are a lot of people out there who are very, very pro public housing, who think that this should be the primary way in which we're solving this crisis. And obviously, these people tend to be on the left. Left leaning YIMBYs and left leaning people generally would love to see the government just build millions of new units. How do you think about just direct publicly owned housing?
Yeah, again, sort of based on lots of historical evidence in the US, we have not implemented this well. That's lots and lots of public housing authorities have just not done a terribly good job, right? The housing that they have is poor quality, the service is poor quality. Some of this is sort of baked into the system from Congress because Congress built the public housing, but then didn't provide a long-term subsidy to keep it in decent condition. And housing authorities have limited abilities to raise money, right? So sort of our evidence has been we have not done this well. I don't think we have solved the fundamental reasons why we didn't do it well. Therefore, I'm skeptical that we can do it better. Again, sort of a big asterisk here is there are other countries that have much, much more social housing, and it's a decent option. It's something that middle income families would choose to live in and provides a lot of stability that private market housing probably won't. So France and Singapore are two different models of this. For the people who want the US to have a lot of social housing, they have in their heads that it will look like Vienna or France or Singapore. If we could figure out how to do that, both how to get the political support for that, how to have long-term financial support, how to have local authorities that are good at managing and operating it across the country, that seems to me like that would be a stronger argument. But I'm just skeptical that we have the systems in place to get those kinds of outcomes.
Yeah, if the United States was a single city state in the way that Singapore is, I would be much more amenable to essentially trying to like centrally plan the amount of housing that we have. Because, for a single city, you could probably do it. It's not an impossible challenge to kind of centrally plan your housing when you're doing it at that scale. For a national initiative, I'm much more skeptical, being who I am, but that's that. I think it's a fair point that other countries have different systems than ours, and sometimes they're more successful, sometimes they're less. I don't think we're the only country that kind of has dysfunction in its public housing. I think the UK has had a lot of that too, in terms of they don't have the projects, but they have the council blocks. And, I think there's a similar reputation there when someone from the US says the projects. But as you pointed out, other countries don't have that connotation in their public housing.
Yeah, and I think there's also, this may be on the next one to go through, but I think there is an argument to have some housing that is not owned by the private sector, that's owned by maybe a nonprofit, if not a public agency, particularly for populations who are really, really vulnerable. Because one of the advantages of sort of taking ownership out of the for-profit sector is that you create the ability for landlords to sort of not only provide low-income rents, but to provide social services and to provide extra protections for people who need it. So for me, the strongest argument for something equivalent to social housing is for people with special needs or people who are particularly vulnerable, to provide them some place where they're not going to be evicted because the landlord wants to sell the property, and turn it into something more profitable.
One of the things you mentioned as part of that conversation is that you don't necessarily think that the US has changed enough. There were reasons why public housing has been a pretty big failure in the United States in a lot of ways, and that public housing projects turned into the projects, which have a terrible reputation, and that you don't think that we've really fixed those issues. And so if we just did more public housing, maybe some of those issues would just continue to rise up. And I want to talk about, in general, where we are now and how we get unstuck from that. Because I think that's a theme that I think about in housing. That's an overarching story, that we're not in a good place and that it's very difficult to get unstuck from the place that we're in right now. And this could be both what you talked about with public housing, or it could be something like, the suburban geography that we just have in this country. I think there are a lot of reasons that geography exists for people's personal preferences, and then for government programs that encouraged them to go out to the suburbs. But whether we like it or not, whether it's good or it's bad, it exists. There's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who live in these areas, and we can't just quickly fix it. So I guess this is almost a huge, impossible question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do we get unstuck from these kind of suboptimal outcomes that we're in? Because it's a very sticky thing. It's very hard to change housing outcomes in any kind of short time frame.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to change outcomes in a short time frame. I think we just need to acknowledge that. Even if we could change all of the problematic policies overnight, so let's suddenly get rid of exclusionary zoning, let's legalize highly diverse housing, let's increase the budget for vouchers.
Hallelujah.
Let's start taxing gasoline and energy at the appropriate level.
Keep going, Jenny.
Let's invest in bus lanes and all of the transit and all of that. Even if we could get the policies in place tomorrow, it would take probably a decade or more before the built environment reflects the new policies. So this is just going to be a slow process, and I think we probably need to be more upfront about the length of time it takes to see changes. It took us 50 years of huge highway subsidies to move everybody out of central cities into the suburbs. It's not unreasonable that it might take us 50 years of really intensive investment in transit and taxing land and gas to get people back into a more compact form. but not trying to change things today because they won't have immediate impacts also clearly isn't the solution. So at some point we have to start making incremental steps in the right direction and build on those.
There's also the issue that people have a lot of their wealth tied up in their homes. It's one of the primary ways in which Americans build wealth is through owning a home. And this has a lot of implications. It has racial wealth gap implications that you cover in the book. But I'm almost more interested in the political implications, as important as the other stuff is, because it provides a direct incentive for people to oppose this problem. When I think about getting us unstuck, I think about that as one of the primary problems, that in a way it's very rational for people in the suburbs, the stereotypical person in a suburb who wants to keep their home's value. It's rational for them to oppose all of these changes, to oppose anything that's going to make housing less expensive. And this is what we talked about at the very beginning of the podcast. You said, I want to explain to people it's actually, it's in their interest for all these good things to happen. And I'd almost push back on that and say it might be a little evil, but it might make the world a worse place. But it is actually in their interest to oppose all of this as fiercely as they can, because 80% of their wealth is tied up in their very expensive home in their exclusionary suburb.
It is rational in the short run, but I think there are actually a lot of costs to the current system that almost everybody pays, and that even high-income people are paying. They're just not aware of it. So one of these is our nation's economy grew by less than it should have over the last 30 years because we're not building enough homes in productive places, right? And at a smaller scale, regional economies just function better.
Isn't there a famous estimate of that by Moretti, maybe?
Yeah, the Moretti and She estimate. So it's something like 36% lower GDP because we're not building enough homes in places like California, right? So we're deterring innovation and new businesses starting and workers living in the most productive place.
Did you see the not to interrupt, but did you see the Brian Kaplan update on that by any chance?
Oh, I don't think so.
So Brian Kaplan, an economist at George Mason, actually found a mathematical error, like a spreadsheet error, in their work. And it turns out they had understated. That final figure should have actually been closer to 50% rather than 36%.
Wow.
So, and this was like years after the paper, I think.
In either way, it's a big number. I think the GDP number is a little abstract to a lot of people, so most of us aren't going to make our day-to-day decisions around what's best for GDP, right? But at the regional level, it's also not hard to see, people who live in expensive neighborhoods and employ landscapers and nannies. Their landscapers and nannies have to live a really long way away, and there are going to be disruptions when they can't get to work on time. So I think that's an easier concept for people to grasp, that your local economy doesn't work when you've got a real mismatch between jobs and housing in particular. The other big piece of this that's very opaque is the climate impacts. So when homes get destroyed by hurricanes or floods or wildfires in California, somebody is paying to bail out the homeowners. Somebody is paying to rebuild stuff, and often to rebuild in the exact same place, and then it burns down again and we rebuild it again. U.S. taxpayers are on the hook for a decent chunk of the current cost of climate change, not off in the future. We're paying these costs now. They're built into our insurance rates in private insurance systems. They're built into our taxes that fund disaster relief programs. They're essentially built into our mortgage interest rates because we're subsidizing people who live in high-risk places. None of that is transparent, so we don't know how much it costs. But if you look at the way our finance and insurance systems are set up, it's hard to avoid that we are paying for this stuff now. And the final piece, which I think don't talk enough about, is there's some real costs to having a lot of families with kids living in poor quality housing, poor quality neighborhoods, going to bad schools, right? Kids are our future workforce. They're our future citizens. And if the U.S. wants to have a healthy, well-educated, productive workforce 20 years from now, we need to invest in better quality living environments for all of our kids today.
There's a great quote you put in the book, and I'm going to use this transition. Watch how slick this is. Um, there's an FDR quote about, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something about, we can't have a third of our people in living in poor conditions, a third of our children growing up in these squalid conditions. And he was talking about housing. And that's exactly what you're talking about now. But it raises a really interesting question for me, which is, what does the history of this look like? When I think about this, I tend to think of housing conditions have got better over time. People don't live in squalor anymore. And just the quality of housing has gone way, way up in terms of how nice our houses are and how many amenities they have. I guess I just am not aware of the deep history of this. Did we used to build a lot more? When did it change? What do we know about this?
We did build a lot more, I'll actually push back a little bit on the housing quality. So for middle class, middle income households, it's unquestionably true that our housing quality is better than it was 30 years ago, including things like, most new houses now are built with air conditioning, which is really important as the temperatures get higher. But there's a lot of really poor quality housing out there, and especially in expensive places, that's what serves low-income households. So there are a lot of poor people who are living in houses that have lead pipes, that have asbestos, that have all sorts of physical health hazards that are particularly bad for kids who are growing up there, right? Lead in your brain keeps you from developing well, right? In places like California, we have really high rates of overcrowding, which is a stressful situation and again is bad for physical and mental health for both adults and kids. So I think middle income families don't appreciate the extent to which there's still a lot of very, very poor quality housing that's occupied by poor people, and so we don't take that as seriously as we should.
I think that's accurate, but I tend to think about these things in like very long sweep of history kind of ways, I guess. And when FDR was giving his speech, a third of the country didn't have wooden floors; they had dirt floors. And,
Right.
and indoor plumbing wasn't available to a third of the country and stuff like that. So, in that sense, things have definitely gotten better. We've hit bare minimums, I think, but unquestionably there is still a lot of overcrowding and a lot of people living in houses that are not well maintained and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, the other question, sort of the longer history of, is there a time period when we used to build more housing? The answer is unquestionably
when
yes.
did all this change? Like, when did we become a nation of NIMBYs, basically?
Starting in the late 1960s and 1970s, and we can map this because we actually have pretty good data on housing supply going back for a long period of time. So we know that, for instance, post World War II, there was an enormous amount of home building that was essentially financed by the government, and so a huge expansion of the housing supply. It's also kind of interesting if you look at cities like New York and sort of look at the age of housing today. There are big swaths of Manhattan that were built in the 1960s through 1980s. It's not that there weren't buildings there before, there were smaller buildings, right? So for most of Manhattan's history, when land values rose enough, we tore down the older, smaller buildings, often poorer quality, and replaced them with bigger buildings and more total housing and higher quality. But we have essentially stopped doing that. A lot of the kind of social movements in the 60s and 70s pushes for more environmental reviews, for more community participation in the process. Those had really good intentions to stop damaging projects, but they have largely been weaponized now to stop production of new housing in places we should build, production of things like public transit systems in places where we ought to be improving transit access. And so we have stopped building not just enough housing in the right places, but we've made it much harder to build a lot of the infrastructure that supports that housing.
The great tragedy of Manhattan is that there are fewer people living in Manhattan today than there were 100 years ago.
Yes.
A lot fewer, actually, almost more than 500,000, I think. And there's fewer people living in Brooklyn today than there were 50 or 60 years ago. Like these areas that should still be growing, they're the most economically vibrant part of the country right now. They're just not. I mean, Manhattan and Brooklyn have grown a little bit in recent years, but after decades and decades of actually declining populations.
Yeah, and a lot of that is declining household size because the population is aging. We have more and more one and two person households and fewer families with kids. But of course, if you're a family with kids, Manhattan is a really expensive place to live, and trying to find extra space to accommodate kids who don't generally bring home incomes and contribute to the family budget is really tough.
So we're coming up on time now, and I want to ask the traditional final question that I ask every guest, which is, what should people read if they want to learn more? And I'll start out by saying that people should go pick up the book Fixer Upper by our guest today, Dr. Jenny Schuetz. It's an excellent book, and if you're interested in learning more about housing policy and how we can kind of get out of this mess, you should go pick it up wherever books are sold. I'm sure you can find it. But other than your book, what other resources would you recommend for people who are interested in learning more about housing policy and housing in America?
So there's an absolute classic called Crabgrass Frontier, The Suburbanization of the U.S. By a historian, Kenneth Jackson. And that gives a great overview of sort of how a lot of the current systems were developed and sort of lays the groundwork for our current problems. There's a book called Neighborhood Defenders by Katie Einstein and co-authors. They are political scientists, and they're doing really some fantastic empirical work explaining how our current participatory process is actually anti-democratic. And so that's terrific to know. And then for sort of a slightly more fun one, I would say either read or watch the Netflix series Made, which is about the sort of life history of a single mom who is struggling through poverty. And you could teach an entire housing policy class based around the Netflix series, at least, sort of going through the shortage of housing subsidy and how hard it is to get it, and the kind of shadow housing market that low-income households are often pushed into. So it gives a really, I think, kind of visceral insight into what housing is like for poor Americans.
All right. Well, our guest today has been Dr. Jenny Schuetz. The book is Fixer Upper. Go check it out. Dr. Schuetz, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.